Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 25. Today's guest is photographer Paul Turounet, and we'll be getting to that conversation in just a minute. So, this past weekend, my daughter, my 5-year-old, she had her first sleepover, and actually this was our first time having one of our kids' school friends spend the night, even though our oldest is in 3rd grade now. But anyway, the girls, they ended up staying up pretty late Saturday night, as you do when you have a sleepover. And after we finally put them to bed, we could hear them giggling from down the hall. And eventually, I found myself doing that thing that I remember my parents doing when I was a kid, coming in and telling them to settle down and, hey, this time I mean it. And of course, they would quiet down for a few minutes, but eventually the whispers would turn into giggles, and then the giggles would turn into full-throated laughter, and we'd repeat the whole dance. I remember when I was a kid, my parents or my friends' parents coming in increasingly grumpy as the night would wear on, starting with cajoling, kids, I have to get up early, I really need you to keep it down, to eventually the be quiet right now or else would come out. And yeah, between the girls giggling way into the night and the beginning of daylight savings time, I was a little groggy on Sunday morning. But mostly I was just thinking about how, for at least that one night, all I was really thinking about was 2 little girls just taking joy in each other's company, just being excited at a new experience and having a good time, and how wonderful that was, and how wonderfully uncomplicated. These days I find myself so preoccupied so often with the news and with resistance, and I'm often so full of anxiety or resolve or just exhaustion. But for that one brief moment, I got to put all that aside and watch my daughter and her friend have fun and remember being young myself, being that young. And I know it's a privilege to get to put that kind of anxiety aside, but, it really did help pull me through. And, I thought I'd throw it out there to you. What's pulling you through? So, you can tweet at me, channelOpenPod, or email at podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com. Anyway, as I mentioned, today's guest is photographer Paul Turounet. I first became acquainted with his work last fall when I was showing some of my books to Jennifer DiCarlo of the JDC Gallery for portfolio review. And she mentioned his books as something that might be of interest to me. And it turned out they were. I got a chance to visit her gallery the next day and check out a couple of his books that she had. The first one called Tierra Brava, and then one called Estamos Buscando A. And both of them were really interesting to me. They did things with the book form that went beyond just presenting the images. And then, his work largely deals with the border region between Mexico and the U.S., and that's always relevant here in San Diego. But, over the past few months, that's obviously become extremely relevant. So I was pleased to get the opportunity to talk with him for the show. Now, I've put links to 3 of his bodies of work into the show notes. Those are Tierra Brava, Bajo La Luna Verde, and Estamos Buscando A, so you can check those out. Also, if you're in the San Diego area, Paul has images included in a group exhibition called Weather on Steroids, The Art of Climate Change Science, and that's up now at the La Jolla Historical Society through May 21st. And then it'll be moving to the San Diego Central Library Art Gallery from June 10th to September 3rd. Also, Paul will be showing work from his series All Seems Beautiful at the next Open Show San Diego here at the Museum of Photographic Arts in Balboa Park on April 6th. And his Estamos Buscando A book was recently reviewed in Bomb magazine, and I've put links for all of those into the show notes. Okay, so let's go. Here's my conversation with Paul Turounet. So how you doing?
I'm doing all right. I've been looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah,
it's been taking a little time, but we finally got the door kicked down.
Yeah, yeah. So I was thinking about your work, and I was thinking about so the first time we met, sure. And I'm not sure if I knew your work very long before this, but it was in October right. At the Medium Festival.
At the Medium Festival.
That's where we met, and And I was thinking about how at that time, none of us really knew what was coming right around the corner.
Yeah, I could see it coming because I've been traveling through the United States, and particularly I guess those are the red states?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been traveling through the red states the last couple of years, so not to suggest I could foresee things, but I could sense that there's some changes going on in the country. So yeah, it is curious how the politics have suddenly shifted in such a manner to where the discussion of the U.S.-Mexico border is front and center.
Yeah, and since that topic is so central to your work, like I just liked your work already, and that's why I wanted to talk to you when I first started talking to you, because I think it's a really interesting topic, especially living here in San Diego. But I did not quite foresee how much more relevant it was going to become in such a short time. I think, to whatever degree any of us might have been able to, or were or weren't surprised by how the election turned out. I don't know if anybody was quite ready for exactly the scale.
No, I would probably agree. Well, especially here along the coast, and then in addition to that, being along the border, to hear the rhetoric and the discussion being what it is. Mm-hmm. That part, I think, has caught people off guard.
Yeah,
and even for some people that are living on the border, even more so probably, I would suggest in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And I think this has just rattled and shook the ground literally on the border.
Yeah,
and created a lot of and the border culture in Mexico is such that there's already an air of uncertainty and anxiety anyway, because it's a place that's in between, and so the psychology that exists on the border is always one of, to me, it's always faster there. Mm-hmm. Things are always moving quicker. There's a sense of uncertainty and anxiety as a result of that, and not knowing.
Yeah.
And so now, since January, well, since November, but more so even here in the last month, mm-hmm. or whatever it is, 34 days and counting. With what's been going on, that ground is shaking pretty severely.
Yeah.
For people, and I mean the ground shaking in a metaphorical sense.
Yeah.
It's curious to see how the dialogue is transpiring.
Yeah. So I was just sort of brushing up on your website mm-hmm. this morning, and it in the bio there it said that you got your MFA in '95, uh-huh. and pretty quickly after that you sort of gravitated towards traveling through the border region. Uh-huh. And so there's three bodies of work of yours that I'm familiar with.
Sure.
And I think in order, I'm not sure quite the order they.
The order starts with Tierra Brava, mm-hmm. and then that actually started in the spring of '95.
Okay.
I was still in grad school. I remember it was a bad winter. In the Northeast, and I'm like, I need to go somewhere where it's warm. Mm-hmm. So at the time I was married, and Prop 187 was a California initiative dealing with what kind of rights would be afforded to migrants in California. Mm-hmm. And so she and I would have debates. It was in the news. And so I'm the kind of person that rather than trying to understand something through media or news or what I read, I like to go to the place, see for my eyes. And when I got to I initially went to the border region, specifically Douglas Agua Prieta. Don't ask me why I picked that spot, because it was in Arizona. And I just started kind of traveling around on both sides, just seeing what it looked like. At the time, there wasn't a wall there. There was this big ditch that represented the line and a barbed wire fence. And then there was a Douglas and Agua Prieta, our sister cities. There's a port of entry there. And so I focused a lot of picture making in that area. And there was also, going west from there, there's a Naco, Sonora, and a Naco, Arizona, and there is a border wall there, comparable to the wall that had been built in Tijuana, in San Isidro, Tijuana border. And so I had made some pictures there. I showed them in a critique during grad school, and then during my final critique, and they're like, okay, so what are you going to do next? And, after 2 years of grad school, it's like, yeah, what am I going to do next? It just seemed to make sense to go back to that place, but do it in a more extensive manner. And one of the reasons I went to grad school was to start putting forward applications for fellowships and grants. Get somebody else to pay for it. And so I applied for a Fulbright fellowship that first year I got out of grad school, and I got waitlisted for it. And I'm like, waitlisted. And it turns out Mexico, to get a Fulbright to Mexico, is one of the toughest countries to actually get into. And I called the international, I can't remember what it's called, it's IEE or something. It's run through the State Department. And I called them, and they said, what do I got to do to get this thing? I said, well, you need to pick a different country. And this was in the mid-'90s. And I remember the woman goes, why don't you go to Colombia? And I'm like, because I don't think a white guy walking around with a camera in Bogota is a good idea, because of the Pablo Escobar and the drug wars that were going on in Colombia. And I don't know why she picked Colombia. And so I actually applied for the grant, the fellowship, the following year. And I figured if I got it, cool. If I didn't get it, then I was just going to move there. I had no idea what I was going to do. That's how important the urgency was for me. And during that first year, or that first time I applied for it, I actually went through a divorce. In fact, I got the letter being waitlisted the same time I got served papers for being divorced, which coincided with my birthday. So it was
wow.
It was a triple whammy, all in one day.
Wow.
And I remember I was driving this old Cadillac, and I just remember sitting in the Cadillac. It was a beautiful car. It was like from Goodfellas. It was fire engine red with a white top. I just remember sitting in the car crying, because I'm like, how did I get to this place? And so I applied for it. I was determined. So I applied for it the second time. And within a couple days of getting the divorce papers, the waitlist letter, I figure I need somebody in Mexico vouching for me. So I flew to El Paso, Texas, walked over to Juarez and met somebody to get them to support what I was going to do. Literally write a letter of support. And I actually think that helped. That was the difference maker, because it demonstrated that somebody in Mexico felt this was important to do. And so I got the Fulbright in 1997, and the Fulbright provided me financial resources to travel for an entire year plus, specifically in Mexico, to make photographs. Now, I had made in my proposal, I don't even have it anymore, but I do recall I was going to create this juxtaposition of culture and society from one side of the border to the other. And I started making pictures, and I felt it was started to get into this kind of comparison contrast thing. They were bad photographs. I wasn't really interested in it, and I had met somebody who said, why don't you just do what you want to do?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I did. I just decided I'm going to just make pictures that I feel like making and that I want to make, without feeling the pressure of, I've got somebody that is going to want to, when you get a grant, you feel like you have to address what you proposed.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I ended up doing was traveling from one end of the border to the next. I started in Juarez, which is an odd place to start, smack dab in the middle. But it was an interesting place to start because it represents the start of basically two borders, a desert border and the river border. And in the 90s, this is at a time during NAFTA, the two borders, which are one border, were very different. And I could only attribute it to the fact that there was water and dry sand. And that affects people's kind of attitudes and psychology in a space. When you're with the river, it's a little more arid, and clearly with the desert, it's dry, and I think that weighs on people in different ways. And so I started in Juarez, and then I traveled it into the interior and skirted all the way back to Matamoros, and then from Matamoros gradually made it all the way to Tijuana over the course of a year. And in 98, so that it went from 1997 through 98, 99. In 98, when I got to Tijuana, I was kind of nice because I had a portfolio of photographs, so I just walked into Centro Cultural Tijuana and presented myself my box of 10 pictures, and then met the director all in one day, and they said, we want to give you a show. I'm like, awesome. And then it dawned on me, I didn't ask when. And it turned out they wanted to do it that year. So I had met with them in May, and they wanted to show the work in September.
Wow.
So
that's pretty fast.
It was super fast. And so I used to work at a color lab up in the San Francisco Bay Area as a printer. And so fortunately, they gave me keys to the lab to print during off hours. Didn't have to pay for anything. And then Ilford supplied all the color materials because this was traditional RA4 color printing. And framed everything, got it down down to Sakut, and it was great because I exhibited with, it was a solo show, but there was also a solo show of Pedro Mayer's work, who's one of Mexico's prominent photographers. And it's interesting because he's worked on both sides of the border as well. So it was an interesting juxtaposition of these two different sensibilities that were kind of the same. I shoot in color primarily. All the work I was shooting was in color. He shot in black and white and color. His were digitally constructed. That's what he's known for. And so that whole series happened really fast. And I never really had an opportunity to live with the work. And when I work with students, I suggest to them, it's important that you live with your work. And the edit that I did, it was a good edit, but it, for that time, it was only after a good number of years passed by that I really got to spend time with the work, literally going through the contact sheets, making, work prints, doing different sequential edits of the work. I had always envisioned it as a book, in addition to an exhibition. And it wasn't until, gosh, mid-2000s? Later, even later than that, where I finally worked through an edit.
Yeah.
It was basically maybe, 8 years afterwards where I worked through an edit. And because of the narrative and some of the conceptual concerns I was touching upon, there needed to be some emotional detachment. Because in part, the reason I was on the border in the first place was because at the time I was going through, in 95 and 96 through some real personal stuff. And I was really in search of my own sense of self, my own sense of who I am as a person, as a man, as a photographer, as an artist. And that's what drew me to the border, because the border region is one of psychological uncertainty. There's a physical displacement, there's an emotional displacement, and I felt it was important for personal reasons as well as professional reasons to put myself in that kind of space, psychological space and physical place. And so it took time it took a long time to work through the edit.
Yeah, I think a lot of people probably don't really realize how much time it can take to do things like that. Especially, I feel like, I don't know if this is a new phenomenon, because I've only really been aware of the art world for, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years. But I definitely read a lot about other people's takes on it, and it seems like there's a real focus right now on just like really cranking stuff out.
I would agree with
having
that.
a new series come out maybe every year,
and it's quick, and you get a show, get the work out there, get it reviewed, try to get an exhibit. I also do books, so the proliferation of book publishing.
But your books are pretty different from what you see coming out of like a publishing house, because like especially this particular book, the Tierra Brava book, is it's an art object in itself. Are they handmade or did?
No, they're printed commercially. The book structure itself, but then in this one, they're actual 4x6 digital chromogenic prints that are each individually tipped in. So
it's pretty labor intensive.
Yeah, it takes. Gosh, the first one took over, I think, 2.5 hours to make.
Yeah,
and then I figured out a way to kind of do it quicker in a production mode, but it does take time. And I wanted the book. When I was in Mexico, my grandmother passed away, and she had. And I actually drove all the way from Matamoros to San Antonio to get on an airplane to get back to the Bay Area. And my father said, "Well, is there anything?" We were going through her stuff, and he goes, "Is there anything you want?" I'm like, "Well, I'm going to be heading back to Mexico, so I don't have it, But I remember she had this small little Bible, and she would stuff stuff in it. Anything of importance to her, she would put in this little Bible. And it was such a personal object. And I brought it back down with me to Mexico, and I would look through it. And my grandmother she was probably the most important woman in my life at that point in time. As a person, she was always supportive of me. So I'd look through this thing, and when I started thinking about creating the book for Tierra Brava, I kind of thought about this object that my grandmother had and the personalness of it. And I want, the book's modeled off my FM3 Visa. So my FM3 the actual Visa is small. So I, in order to have the photographs be readable, it was necessary to scale it up, but not too much so that it would still have the reference point, but then allow for the photography to be engaged in a very intimate, personal manner. And that's the idea, is that the border, the photographs become just a jumping off place to dive into a look at a place, but also a psychological state of mind.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think a lot of people, there's been a lot of talk about the book format the last several years, and a lot of people are thinking about it. But I think a lot of people still tend to think of the book just sort of as a vessel, like it's just like a substrate to deliver the images. But particularly with this book, and I was happy that I got a chance to see it at the JDC gallery before she left town. But it's a really, like, the book itself, the whole thing from the moment you pick it up is part of the experience of it. And I think that's a really impressive accomplishment. You do see some people, I think, like in the book arts community, who are thinking about stuff like that, but for some reason it hasn't really made its way into the photography community to the same degree.
I think there are some photographers that think this way. Somebody whose work I've been drawn to is a guy named Raymond Meeks, who makes these more handmade type books to help deliver his narrative structures. And they're really interesting. So it's interesting because I was up at a photo book symposium up at UC Berkeley last weekend, and Gerhard Steidl was talking about just his publishing philosophy, and he's worked with top photographers, and he controls every aspect of the book production. From having his own papers made to finding the book. Everything he's got his hand on every aspect of it, and working with the photographer, to produce the highest quality book. However, they still fall into that kind of traditional book structure: white pages, nice book cloth, well-bound books, well printed, well presented, and I see those kind of books as they're beautiful. I love them. But it's taking the photographic experience that was on the wall and putting it on a piece of paper, binding it so that it can be accessible on a more tight, regular basis. Because in an exhibition, it goes up. You see it for whatever period of time it's in the institution or space, the gallery, and then it comes down. Whereas, and what's great about photography is beautiful for books. You can take it down and look at it at any point in time. I think, for myself, I wanted the book to be something that you would keep picking up. That was, you hope that's something that can be achieved. In that. Like when you read a literature book, you pick it up and you read it, and then you're done. And maybe you'll read it a second time. Or if it's a series of short stories, maybe you'll reread those things. So in thinking about book structure, I'm seeing it as something that, how many times can somebody engage it and spend time with it? And how will that affect how they interpret the work and the flow of the work? So this one has ephemeral objects in it.
Yeah, that's one of the things I found really interesting about it.
And I think, so as to kind of it's almost as if you were delving into somebody's private little moment that I've decided to make somewhat public.
Yeah.
It's only in an edition of 50, so as the way it is, at some point in time I'll probably want to print something a little more within the traditional structure without tipping them all in. That's the hard part. So.
Yeah. It is sort of an interesting thing because I do book arts myself, and it's always kind of it's sort of a weird trade-off to have to make where thinking about the book as almost like a sculptural object.
Sure.
It allows a lot of expression that can't be done in another way.
Right.
But also, having something that's so labor intensive and typically even like an edition of 50 for an artist book is pretty big.
Yeah.
Like it really does, like as you said, one of the big benefits of a traditionally published book is that you can get out, you might do a run of 5,000 of them. For photo books, that would be on the big side.
Yeah, that's on the high end.
But, you can reach a lot more people that way. So I don't know. Whenever I'm thinking about my own work, there's always this sort of trade-off when I'm thinking about doing a new book project of, how do I find that balance between, I actually want people to see this.
Sure.
But also I want to be able to have it be the experience that I want.
Yeah. No, I completely understand where you're coming from. It's something I've been thinking about. One of my takeaway from the photo book symposium, and it was interesting because there was Steidel there. There was Paul Sheik from, TBW Books up in the Bay Area. He's got the same kind of philosophical approach as Steidel. And then they had a publicist there, a designer there, and, the business of photography books. And the business of photo books doesn't necessarily reconcile with what the photographer ideally would like to do.
Yeah.
Because the publicist was asked, she said, with photographers, they would much prefer to do editions of 100 or 150, which makes sense because there's more of that creative control. Maybe be able to do more kind of the, as you were mentioning, the artist book kind of approaches with materiality and maybe the structure of it and the scale and those kind of considerations versus the commercially produced book, where, she was saying, well, you need a minimum of 1,000 if you want to make money. And at that point, I'll make money. The designing cost, the publicity cost, the printing cost, the distribution costs, and suddenly it's your photography, but it's in a whole different realm. And for the hopes of more sets of eyes looking at it. And the problem is trying to find that sweet spot, as you're saying. How do you find that sweet spot? How many? It's like, okay, I know what I want to make. How many of these things can I make without losing money? In photo books, you'll lose money traditionally, right? Yeah. So it's a case of, and I guess, with the advent of self-publishing, that's problematic because you've got to hustle the design, the printer, the distribution, the publicity, all those things. So, it's been trying to find those little magic sweet spots where it just makes sense. So, with this one, it felt like it was the right approach. And I think it was important. What is it I want to make? Can I make it? And how can I make it so that, it's not too extravagant with the quote book arts part yet, reflects my intentions and my conceptual concerns. So with that one, I felt like it it hit the mark. The book, because all the pictures are tipped in, it gets a little fat.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm noticing that on some of them, the binding, it's a saddle stitch binding, the binding's getting a little loose, and I'm like, okay, I'm sure after a while that's going to start to become a problem. And I'm just waiting for somebody to call me, some collector, and go, some of the pages are getting loose, but I'm okay with that, because that's actually I want this thing to kind of feel...
I mean, that's what would happen to a real...
I want it to feel worn, and I want it to feel like it's been used. The cover material, as it gets handled, it's starting to... the ink starts to show abrasion marks and stuff, and I like those aspects of it, because then it's reflecting something that is aging.
Yeah. Well, and that's like with the form of that particular book.
Yeah.
Not necessarily all books, but that particular one, that feeling of having a thing be personal that has been handled. I mean, that's really part of the experience. Yeah. So another thing. So moving on to another body of work of yours. So I guess the next one after that, after Tierra Brava, would be the Bajo La Luna Verde.
Bajo La Luna Verde.
So I was looking through that one again this morning, and one of the things. So this is a series where you're combining images and text, and it if I'm understanding it right, it's describing a physical journey that you took in the Sonoran Desert that would be similar to what a migrant would be experiencing.
Yeah.
Is that sort of right?
Yeah. When I finished the actual photographing of the Tierra Brava series, there just came a point where, like, okay, I'm done making the pictures. It's the making the pictures part tends to be the easiest part.
Mm-hmm.
It's what do you do with them after that? That's the part that takes some time, and working through ideas. So, and that was all shot with a Leica, small format, color negative film. And at the time, I started teaching at the University of San Diego, and I just felt a desire to kind of do something different.
Mm-hmm.
I was working with a couple of faculty members who had been at MIT. They were both installation artists, and I started kind of thinking about space, objects, materials. And at the time, I started making photographs. When I did the Tierra Brava series, I intentionally stayed away from the whole border cliche imagery.
Mm-hmm.
Because I didn't want it to be part of that dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I started Bajo La Luna Verde, and that was really just a smaller segment of the larger Estamos Buscando A series, they kind of happened simultaneously. I started working with Polaroid positive negative film, and I went down to Tijuana, and I made a photograph of a migrant. And he's holding on to a piece of barbed wire fence next to the border wall down by the bull ring down by the ocean. And I printed the photograph using liquid light on a small piece of steel. And then somebody at the University of San Diego said, well, you need to talk to this theology professor who was running what was called the Transborder Institute. And the moment I showed it to him, he said to me, do you realize what you've made here? And I said, yeah, it's a portrait photograph on a piece of steel. It was like a 1/8-inch piece of steel. So, and it was only a little 5x7 print.
Mm-hmm.
He says, no, you've made a retablo. You've created a retablo, an ex voto, which is it's a votive offering in the Catholic religion, where it's an image that's placed behind the altar to give thanks for being delivered through a miraculous event. And he says, you should do some research on this. And he was right, I should do some research. And he says, and if you come back to us with a proposal, we might be able to give you some money so you can keep doing this. And as a young, I wasn't a tenured professor and needing revenue to support my work, needing money to support my work. I'm like, well, I'll write up a proposal. So I started making portraits of migrants on the border.
Mm-hmm.
And I started printing them large scale on 16 by 20 inch pieces of steel that was an eighth inch thick. And then I would reinstall the images on the border wall in the place where I had made the original portrait.
Yeah.
And so I did a series of that along the border wall in between Tijuana and San Isidro. And simultaneously, the migrant experience was really exploding, with lots of people starting to cross. And this is the mid-2000s. And so the desert, particularly the Sonora Desert, had become just a really active region for border crossings. Mm-hmm. So I started going out there, and I went to, what's the name of that place? Sasabe, Sonora. And there's a Sasabe, Arizona, and it's this dirt road town on the Mexican side. And I just started making more work out there. And I decided, I felt it was important I had this dream about being in this cocoon of trees, this brush for protection. And so I had this kind of picture in my mind. And so with the Bajo La Luna Verde, while I was doing the site-specific installation work that became the impetus for Estamos Buscando A, I went out to the desert and just started making pictures of this kind of like journey I took along the Mexican border, staying on the Mexican side, and heading west. I hiked for 12 miles from the port of entry out into the desert. And I was about anywhere at any point in time right on the border to half mile in, because of just how I was navigating pathways and stuff. And making different kinds of pictures of the things I would see. You'd find the water jugs, but you'd find women's undergarments, dead animals. I found there was a grave marker out there. You'd find all these. I'd see all these things that you would just, migrant shrines, things you wouldn't necessarily expect to see out in the desert. And towards just before sunset, I found this bush, this tree that I had envisioned for myself to make a photograph, and it was going to be a self-portrait. And so I set everything up. The picture I had in my mind was of a person in a fetal position in this cocoon of brush, and then I put a green light on the subject, which was me, and as if it was, and it was shot, from a high vantage point looking down, so it looked like this light was from above peering down. I ended up making the photograph. Gosh, it was after midnight. After midnight. It was so, I was way far away from, the port of entry. I had no idea what was around me. And I shot, I think, 6 exposures of this moment, and 2 turned out. They were 5-minute exposures, and I had to run this long cable release. It had this rubber it was one of those rubber ball ones where you have to hold it tight the whole time. So I held this rubber shutter release for 5 minutes, and I had to stay still because it utilized a flash. I had a green filter over a flashlight, and then I wanted the ambient light. So it was a 5-minute exposure. And I would just sit still. And it was a really surreal experience because you could hear all the things going on. Way off in the distance, I could hear dogs barking, or I could hear a truck driving around. And then once I finished up the pictures, I packed everything up, and I just kind of fell asleep in this cocoon bush, because at that point in time, it's 1:30 in the morning. It's interesting because of the Earth's rotation. There were a lot of stars, and then all of a sudden it just went pitch black. And I had run out of water while I was traveling around. I had a couple of like power bar kind of things to eat, and I just tried to sleep. And I'd hear things like in the ground. I'm sure it was like some kind of little rabbit or some little critter running around, but it sounded like footsteps. And at that point, it was so cold that I'm just like, you know what? I'm going to cross the border. I can't do this. So I grabbed my stuff. I hopped. At that point, it's just a barbed wire fence. I just hopped the fence, and I followed cattle trails till I have a great sense of direction, so I knew where I kind of had to go. So I followed cattle trails till I found a road. And all during this time, I was just hoping that I would get intercepted by the Border Patrol, because at that point in time, I'm like, I'll deal with whatever legal consequence there is, and at least they'll have some hot coffee, and I can get a ride. And by the time I hit a paved road, it was sunrise, and it was a Border Patrol shift change. And all these guys were driving by me. Not one of them stopped. I wasn't inclined to flag them down, but I figured, because I'd just keep walking. But if I got caught, then I got caught. And because I ride a motorcycle, I walked all the way back to the motorcycle and loaded up. And then I drove north. At that point in time, I was physically and emotionally spent. And I drove up. There's a little like intersection. It's called 3 Points. From the border up, and it's on the way to Tucson. So I drove up to this place at 3 Points, and there's a little cafe there. And I just sat down, and I got a cup of coffee, and I was just, I remember the waitress going, "Are you okay?" Because she's looking at me like, I was spent. And I put that together as a little book. As an installation, it's a large backlit transparency, which, is a completely darkened area. Really reflects the experience. And I did the writing and put it together as a little book, primarily for myself. It was in the share, but primarily for myself. I felt it was important to put myself in that kind of circumstance, to literally go through all these things, just so it could inform my own understanding of what to think about when making the photographs that would become part of the Estamos Buscando A series. Because at that point in time, the thing I was most interested in, I'm apolitical on the border. It is such a complex issue on so many different fronts. What I was most interested in is the psychological space people are placing themselves in the moment they hit that line. And I think trying to tap into that understanding required me to literally do it myself so that I could then better understand this, particularly for myself. What kind of things would I be thinking about? How am I reacting to this? What is it like, as time goes by? How does it affect you? And there was a definite after effect. So, that became it's like an in-between. It's a bridge between the Tierra Brava and the Estamos Buscando A. It's to get from one place to the other. It's almost like a border itself. It's like a border crossing.
One of the things that struck me about that book was, in some ways, it seems a lot more like of a contained overall experience than the other two.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But what really was interesting to me was because this is something I think about a lot is how text and images interact with each other, and what one is good at and what the other is good at. And first of all, let me just say that I thought it was really well written.
Thank you.
But the way that you use the text really provides a lot of access to your inner state, and to it provides more of in providing that access to the inner state, it provides more sensory experience, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But then the photographs, because one of the things I think about a lot is, right, because images are really good at certain types of things, but they're not really good at telling you what people are thinking or feeling.
Yeah,
usually.
I would propose that. I hear this a lot, that pictures tell stories, and I'm like, no, they don't. People do.
Yeah.
And then maybe is that what you're alluding to? Is maybe those kind of ideas?
Yeah, but then what the pictures, one of the things about the text is that the text, because it is very internal, and you're talking about literally what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and so it allows me as a reader to access, gosh, I know what it's like to be thirsty, and he's thirsty here, so I can think about that. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't tie it as concretely. Where the photographs, by mixing these two things together, it allows you to always come back to that this is concretely tied to a specific place, and also it makes it not just to a specific place, but the fact that that you were really in these places,
Yeah, I guess maybe this is the running thread through the work with all three series is how does photography interact and relate to narrative and written word, whether it's appropriated text from a migrant guide for the Estamos Buscando A series to the facsimile of a handwritten note from my ex-wife to me, to the narrative that the written narrative that takes place in Bajo La Luna Verde, this kind of little travel, this little journey that I take you on, and that, and particularly for that one, I think the text functions very differently than, and you're observing this, than the photographs. While the photographs have this visual discourse, so does the text. they're different. And I think it's important that text in photographs function differently. But their inherent nature dictates that. And I think when one's trying to mirror the other too much, that's where it becomes problematic. And then the photographs are becoming an illustration of the text, or the text is becoming an illustration of the photographs, or a surrogate, and it just not as effective. Because which is probably why one of the reasons I'm kind of drawn to the notion of activating a space in a gallery for almost the same kind of reasons, is that we have all these different sensory approaches, right, that we can engage work in. We can hear things, we can see things, we can read them, we can feel them. So I think I've been interested in how can photography relate to these things as part of these, as an experience. So yeah.
One of the other things that I found myself thinking a lot about as I was looking through that and reading it, and had to do with, so here you're sort of putting yourself in the shoes of a migrant. In some ways, yes and no, right?
Yeah, because I wouldn't dare.
I can see.
I've only done it for whatever that small little portion of that experience is like. Haven't traveled into the interior. Like, I have gone all the way down to the southern border in Chiapas and spent time through the interior of Mexico, and been in some places where I get it. I understand. And again, the reasons why people come to the border immensely complex. Economics, sure, but man, there is a whole layer of other things going on. Of why do people come to where, and it's as individual as anything we go through. So I didn't want to necessarily portray and reflect upon what I did as quote a migrant experience, as much as for me understanding that one little sliver of what that experience was like.
Yeah. So, and sort of the way that you just responded just now, really is getting at the thing that I was thinking about as I was reading this, that I think, how to put this, I think that there is a thing that happens a lot of times with American artists, where we will go to a place or insert ourselves into another culture, and it's sort of appropriative, or it can be. And one of the things that really struck me about this piece of yours was that it didn't really strike me that way, because and one of the things you mentioned just as we were talking, it's in the text also, this thing that you were mentioning about how all these Border Patrol guys drove right by you. And so it feels like it is creating empathy with one aspect of the migrant experience, but also noting that this is different for you than it would have been for a migrant in that same place.
Yeah, you're touching on something. I was can't remember her name now. I was interviewed by somebody, and because she's doing a presentation, and it was literally on insider-outsider sensibilities and approaches, and touching upon what you just mentioned, of as a white male, me going into Mexico to photograph Mexican culture and what that experience looks like, raises a lot of questions. and it's come up at times, like in artist talks, like, why are you photographing in Mexico?
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't you photographing in the United States? And it's a valid question. It's fair. For me, I look at it. My sensibilities of it, my understanding have been more of not necessarily am I an insider or an outsider of culture, or an insider or an outsider of place, but am I an insider or outsider of psychological space?
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, I felt from a emotional and psychological where I was personally, being in this uncertain, anxious, in-between area, that what I experience in my own personal existence, I think there's something universal to that,
mm-hmm.
that crosses borders and crosses cultures and crosses places. And at that point, I felt that's why I'm making the work, because it's reflecting those intentions. And those are the things I'm interested in conceptually exploring and making work about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's, because it ends up being becomes reflective of my own intentions.
Mm-hmm.
What am I making here? Why am I making it? And what am I addressing?
Yeah.
And what's the thing that is driving that? And
yeah.
so for the Bajo work, I hope that it reflects these kind of universal existential questions and things that we think about, yet within the context of this specific place, and all the things that are associated with that place that are also existential and universal
mm-hmm.
to us. So it's a tough space, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
On many levels, right?
Yeah. So I actually could keep talking about all of this stuff forever, but we've been going a while now. We should probably take a quick break.
Okay.
And then we'll come back and do the second segment.
Sounds good.
All right. So for the second segment of the show, I always ask my guests to just pick a topic of their own and be anything they want. So what's on your mind?
What's on my mind? Oh, gosh. I've had all kinds of things on my mind. I'm getting prepared to do the Estamos Buscando installation at the San Diego Art Institute.
Oh, cool.
In September and October.
Yeah, I just talked to Ginger for the show not that long ago.
That's going to be at least what I've got envisioned in my head, a large installation. I'm working through new work in terms of making these kind of handmade portfolios. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of been on my mind. I went to this photo book symposium, so books are on my mind. Mm-hmm. What else? I've been thinking about space. So when I was at SF MoMA, there was this William Kentridge. I don't know if you've heard of him.
The name sounds familiar.
He's a South African artist, does drawing and animation. And there was this awesome installation. It was 5-channel video, sound, music, animation. It was a 30-minute loop. I sat there for the entire 30 minutes.
Wow. I
was just amazed.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with photography.
Yeah.
There were some Anselm Kiefer paintings there that I hadn't seen before, where he's a German painter, and it was interesting because he had layered his paintings with a lot of these particular paintings. They were like fields, these German fields that really referenced the history, for me, of Germany, and winter scene. They felt like cold, detached, the passing of history. But then he had layered it with these pieces of hay. There was a lot of spatial depth to him, and I was really drawn to that. So, for photographers, we create these flat two-dimensional things.
Yeah.
So as I'm thinking about my border wall installation and just thinking about space and how to activate it.
It's an interesting thing. I feel like a lot of times, I'm not sure if it's just the nature of the medium and what kind of people get attracted to it. Photography, I think maybe it has something to do with the sort of indexicality of the medium.
Yeah.
But I feel like a lot of photographers or photographic artists tend not to be as interested in stuff outside the plane of the photograph. Or maybe it's, I don't know, I mean, because I didn't go to art school, so I don't know how it's taught in school. But I feel like, and this actually kind of gets...
That's okay. I didn't go to art school either. I just went to grad school for photography. So I don't have a formal training in the traditional arts. I took one drawing class when I was an undergraduate. And in undergraduate, I studied poetry and journalism and advertising. It wasn't until I went to grad school, and there it was only to study photography, and it was pretty insular. It was about your pictures, and we didn't get into the other things. I started getting more exposure to it, and particularly because of being on the East Coast, going down to New York City. Gosh, that's your art school. That's art school.
Yeah.
Go to the galleries, go to the museums.
Yeah.
And just look at work. And so, there's photographers that are clearly interested in other things.
Yeah.
It's just, not as widespread.
It seems to me a lot of times that, like, when I've talked to artists who are, like, visual artists who are not working in photography, or at least not just working in photography, as opposed to people who are primarily photographers, just that there is... I mean, there's all kinds of photographers, right? And, some people are working in studios, some are out in the world, some people are making, semi-sculptural books like you make, and some people are, really focused just on making prints, and there's people working in all different ways, but I feel like the majority of photographers that I know and see are really, like, the photograph, even though people talk about the print as object, the primary thing about the image is what's in the image, not like the
how it's supported.
Yeah, not the substrate, not the space around it, not not any of those other considerations. And I think there's a lot you can do with that, but I also find myself very attracted to thinking about it. There's something exciting about thinking outside of that.
I think recently, in the last, it kind of happened simultaneously with the digital becoming more and more of the approach that photographers are exploring, or artists are exploring, the use of the photographic image within different types of contexts. So even from a sculptural standpoint, so if you see the work of John Chiara, those where there's more, it's a photographic print, but it takes on the shape in a more sculptural manner, even though it's still in a frame. So I think there's photographers that are exploring those ideas and stuff, more so now than probably in its history.
Yeah.
And it's probably in part because, it's so ubiquitous, though I would argue, I teach photography, and I teach the history of photography, and yesterday we were talking about the Kodak #1, and that's when photography became ubiquitous the first time around. So, it kind of goes in these weird little circles. So I think there's been a much more of an exploration of, not only the beauty of what's inside a photograph, but also as an object itself, and taking on different sensibilities and approaches.
Yeah.
So, in particular, you think about scale, materiality, context.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the things that I found really interesting about, because you did Estamos Buscando A as a book also, and I found the book, that was how I first found it, was at the JDC gallery. She had a couple copies of it there, and I was looking through it. It's an interesting as a book, but then when I was learning more about it, and then learned about this sort of the site-specific installations you were doing at the border wall, that really takes it to a different place. And having that that context as you're experiencing the work, and having it tied to a physical location, that's interesting, and it adds something that the image itself can't do.
Yeah, I mean, when you ask me about what do you feel like talking about, just as a topic, gosh, I can go all over the place. But one of the things, and I guess this in part because it came up this week in teaching, working with a portfolio class, students they've taken all these photo classes, and now they're working on their work. And one of the things, I asked them to read various essays in the education of a photographer. And they're short little vignettes, little essays. And one of them's by John Zarkowski called Commitment. And I think it was interesting how we kind of went around the room and talked about what the idea of commitment meant to them as it related to their practice, to their work, to their photography. And some of the issues that come about are, the amount of time somebody has to devote to something, and how can you demonstrate commitment on that? You're a married guy with 3 kids, job, friends, photography, art, podcast. How do you strike that balance for all these things?
Yeah,
and it's a tough thing. Yeah,
quite gotten it figured out yet.
Well, and I think so. In talking with these students, I think it's nice when you can kind of have a cookie cutter like template. Like, okay, here's how they did it. That's how I need to do it. And it actually doesn't work that way. That we all find our own pathway. And the unfortunate part, or maybe the fortunate part, depends on your perspective, is it comes down to some really tough, it's choices. Some people would call them sacrifices. I see that more as a negative thing if you're, quote, having to sacrifice something in lieu of gaining something. Why not get both of it? It's the adage of work hard, play hard. And that's kind of, I was hoping to instill that with the students. It was a little rough for them, though.
Yeah.
Because, you were a student, right? When you're a student, it's almost at the time when you're a student, you're thinking, oh man, I got all this stuff I got going on and all this pressure, and then once you get out in life, you have some kids and married, and you're going, man, I kind of wish I was a student again. Right? I'm like, wow, I had all kinds of, I could do whatever I wanted. Yeah. And I didn't have these other pressures. But, it's all relative to your moment in time. And, and I guess now, I'm going to be turning 55, and I had gotten in a motorcycle accident, and that probably should have been it, a year and a half ago. And I've been thinking about try to savor each moment. Mm-hmm. And in the end, the notion of commitment is even more heightened. And for me, the idea that that's what I've been trying to. So as a thing to talk about. Yeah. Today, I have been thinking a lot about my practice, about what's important and what I want out of my life, and how can I be hitting those points as much as possible each day. Mm-hmm. And so it was interesting talking with the kids. I had them read Sarkowski's little essay on commitment. So what did he have to say about it? And they all say their thing. Mm-hmm. And they have to write it down. And I said, there's no right or wrong answer. But then it became interesting when we were going around the room. And you could pick up on, the students, especially, I guess maybe students been this way their whole lives. They have a little guard up. Mm. They don't want to let their classmates or the teacher know. Mm-hmm. Maybe some more of the personal stuff. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting that out of this discussion, they were kind of starting to let their guard down a little bit in terms of self-reflecting on what does it really mean for me? And at that point, it didn't even have anything to do with photography. And it's interesting how when you with photography, it can be such a narcissistic, ridiculous thing, right? I mean, we obsess over our pictures, and it gets obnoxious after a while.
You can.
Right? I mean, they're just pictures.
Yeah.
And it's not to suggest that they're not important and valuable in terms of what they can provide, in terms of providing meaning for individuals. But they're just pictures. Yeah. But what's interesting is how they lead to these other things that are far more interesting, about how we see things, how we think about things, how we feel about things. And it provides the opportunity for those kinds of discussions that probably can't get contained in the photograph itself. Mm-hmm. So when we had our conversation, it was about that. So maybe I ask you, so what does commitment mean for you?
Wow.
Welcome to my podcast. It's a hard question.
It is a hard question, and I think there's a lot of different ways that people talk about that kind of thing, especially in an artistic context. I think one of the things that I think about in terms of commitment as an artist is, what do I have to do to make this piece that I'm working on work? In terms of art, you can always tell when someone hasn't fully thought it through. You can tell when they're kind of half-assing it. But when someone really commits to understanding the work and executing it so that it is the thing that it needs to be, whether that means, like you were talking about before, spending a lot of time with it. I just finished up a project that took me, I think, 5-6 years to do. And I shot most of the pictures within the first few months, but it just, took me a little while to get there. I think, commitment to, and it also means being committed to letting the art be what it needs to be, and not trying to force it into something else, and not trying to push it out before it's ready, that kind of thing. And then I guess the other thing that I think about too is that I think when I say you can tell when someone's half-assing it, a lot of times I feel like there's a real I think my impression is we're going through sort of a shift right now, but up till recently there's been a real strain of sort of intellectualism in art, especially visual art, and now recently I think we're sort of, one of the things I think that intellectual art, I think it has its place. I think that there's some intellectual art that I've seen has been really amazing, but I always feel a sort of coolness about it in a certain way. Like there's a separation between the artist, the art, and the audience. And some of the things that I've seen more recently that have been the most exciting to me are ones where there isn't that separation, where the artist is willing to be very vulnerable. And to me, that's a form of commitment, of putting it all out there and allowing people in, allowing the audience in, because you're risking something. If it doesn't work, then it costs you something. To me, that's an element of commitment, is having something on the line.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it sounds like a subject that should be explored some more, because it was interesting, the responses I got, like what you said was really curious and interesting. Gosh, you can go off on all these different approaches in terms of discussion, in terms of conceptual art, audience, intention, all these key essentials that go into the making of things, the creation of things, and the sharing of those things. And how that kind of all gets bundled into this idea of commitment, and how it's universal but very different, depending on your perspective, and to some degree probably your life experiences and what you've got going on at that very moment in time. So when the kids go, "Okay, Paul, it's all nice that you asked the questions. Now you'll have to answer it." And my answer is comparable to yours in that I don't think so much about whether the work is intellectual or conceptual or not, who my audience is or not. It's more just about my practice. And in the end, what I would suggest by practice is my way of life. This is who I am, my identity, what I'm about, what's important. And so, and I related some personal experiences where when people get to know me, they say, "Well, gosh, photography seems super important to you." And then when I was married, and then in subsequent relationships, I've heard the phrase, "Well, that's your top priority." And and we all have, quote, priorities.
Mm-hmm.
It could be family, it could be our jobs, it could be our own personal interests, our friends, etc., family. And for myself, when I hear that phrase, I'm like, well, clearly it's unsettling, because somehow the phrase suggests that I'm giving more attention to one thing than another, thus neglecting something. And I think for me, the idea of commitment is to get through all of those pressures, to get past all those pressures, and stay focused on these are the things that I want to do, that are important to do, and not to be dissuaded, and not to be sidetracked. And, the takeaway with the students was, and I had an older student, older meaning roughly my age, compared to the younger ones, who, she beautifully stated that it's important to surround yourself with like-minded people that can form that sense of community for yourself, whether it be people that, in this case, photography, that have that same kind of understanding and sensibility and love for and passion for and desire and drive to want to make work and look at work and devour it. Or somebody that you're in a relationship that understands that this is something that is important to you, and their means of demonstrating their support and their love is to acknowledge that that's important to you. And, and it goes both ways. It's a circular thing. It's not a one-way thing. So, in terms of that notion of commitment, then, it's just a way of life of these are the things that are essential for me to exist. And you do the best you can to balance it.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're over here for a little while because that's where you need to be. That's what you want to be doing. And then you go, and you may go, but I want to get over here. All right? This probably more so than I don't have any kids, so I wouldn't even dare imagine. But I'd imagine that's a tough one.
It is. It's like you say, you make choices.
Yeah.
There's always I think there can be a danger of if you don't know what's important to you, that you aren't able, you can't balance these things unless you know what's important to you. And so if you find yourself pulled in a lot of directions, and then as you say, if you're spending time on one thing, then it can be that you're neglecting something else. And I think that can even make a person feel resentful. Anytime you're doing this thing, you feel like, I wish I could be spending time on that other thing. But then when you're spending time on that other thing, you say, well, I really wish I could be spending time on the first thing. And then you could, find yourself resenting whichever thing that you're not doing right now. You're resenting that for taking away from the thing that you're doing. But I think if you have an understanding of who you are and what's important to you, it doesn't have to be that way, and then you can just make your choices.
And I think what I was trying to communicate with the students is that, I think people know what they want, at least have a fairly good idea, and there's some room for some surprise in there, like, oh, that's nice, didn't really think about that, but I kind of like that. What seems to be more relevant to the discussion, though, is the people that you surround yourself with.
Yeah.
Because those are the ones that are going to be the one putting the pressure on you to cause you to think about, should I be doing this or should I be doing that? Because those kinds of things, I think, are more internally what you want to do. It's what's going on outside of your own personal realm. That is going to put pressures on that. So significant others, family, friends, professional colleagues, because in the end, those are the ones that are saying, hey, I need you over here. I need you doing this. And you're over there going, no, but I need to do this. But I want to be over there doing this. And that's why, with the takeaway at the end of that, I think it was on Tuesday, the takeaway on Tuesday. And it was a hard conversation with the students. It had nothing to do with pictures. They're like, oh, we're here to do pictures. Well, we're going to do a little life stuff. But I think it was revealing. And maybe it's something that it's interesting because in the education of a photographer, I think Zarkowski gave it as part of a talk he did. I don't know. I'll have to look back at what the context of it was. But I thought, gosh, and Zarkowski is such an eloquent writer of photography, and here he comes along writing this little snippet about commitment, and it seems to be essential, necessary. Well, I assign it as a reading, but it seems essential issue that I think would be beneficial for any artist, at the very least any artist, to kind of be taken into consideration to, as they're kind of navigating through all this. Yeah. It kind of serves as a reminder too. Yeah. One of the things I love about teaching is that when you're with students, and they're looking to you as, oh, you're the teacher, you've done these things, you know what's going on. Tell us about it. And it keeps me grounded on humility that, I need the reminder as much in the, quote, education as much as the student does. And it becomes more collaborative at that point, and much more of a mutual exchange of, this is what we need to be doing. And it's nice that we're afforded this opportunity to sit and talk about it for a few moments. And cool. Now let's go make some pictures. Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty good.
It's funny, too, because, I think about it. When you're young, especially when you're young, and for some people maybe even when they're not young, but when you're learning about whatever it is you're learning in school, you don't always consider the why of it. You just consider the how of it. And I think that's one reason why, for me at least, it's so rare to find student art that's really deeply powerful, because it can be, a lot of times people are sort of interested at that point in their lives in techniques and in other people's ideas, or, sort of like working their way through their influences. But that, when you say like, what does this have to do with photography? This is like, we just wanted to talk about pictures. But, what's the point of taking the pictures if it doesn't have to do with life in some way?
It's always been, this is my 17th year teaching, and it's been the most important part of, one, you can't teach photography. It's such a ridiculous thing to teach. I've always felt I'm at the service of the medium, and as a result, I'm an advocate for it. And I'm an advocate for how can the medium be used for the expression of curiosities and ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the most interesting thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's what gravitated me towards photography in the first place. I used to write visually, seemed to make sense to make pictures.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I struggle with words when you can press a button. Wow, that's cool. If it were only that easy. So when I've worked with students, what's great about teaching at a community college, 2-year Grossmont College, is you get a range of students from somebody young, 18, 19 years old, to somebody who's your own age. And they all have this one interest. And they have different perspectives, different experience. Gosh, there's such a range. And it's the ideas. What's going on inside their head? What's going on inside their spirit, their body, and how can we use those eyeballs and this device that you got in front of you to go exploring these curiosities and ideas. And so I've always erred on the side of the ideas and the aesthetics of photography, and then back end it with the technical stuff. So sometimes the students aren't as technically proficient, but the raw idea starts coming through. And I've always felt that you can always backtrack.
Mm-hmm.
The technical stuff, that's easy to pick up on. So, like this semester, I started working, it's a basic black and white photography. It's a class called personal photographic vision. And we start out with 35 millimeter film and going in the darkroom. And this is one of the first times we've gone so fast. The cameras were in their hand the second class. We're out making pictures in process of film and printing pictures within the first and second week. I haven't done anything this fast before. And I'm digging the results. I'm digging the energy. I'm digging the, because traditionally when and I see this and I still see it, I see kids all sitting in a room watching the instructor at the whiteboard write down the shutter speed scale and how a light meter works. And I'm like, oh, I don't think that works in the 21st century. So, yeah.
Well, hey, I really appreciate your taking the time to
Thank
talk
you.
to me. I had a really good time.
This was great. Enjoyable time.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, you can find Paul's work included in the Weather on Steroids exhibition at the La Jolla Historical Society through May 21st, and then again at the San Diego Central Library Art Gallery from June 10th to September 3rd. And Paul will also be presenting his series All Seems Beautiful at Open Show San Diego on April 6th, and you can find details for those in the show notes. And that is our show. Remember, if you want to chat with me about anything you heard today or on a previous episode or even, just about what you're having for lunch, you can email me at podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com. You can also tweet at me at channeleopenpod or find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechanneleopen. If you enjoyed today's episode, an easy and free way that you can help out the show is by leaving a review on iTunes, and there is a link in the show notes to do that. Also, you can support the show by donating to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's sake like the drink, and river like river. And you can subscribe to the show and never miss an episode via iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. Next time, our guest will be writer and filmmaker Barbarella Focus, so be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.